Freetown, the capital city of Sierra Leone, was jolted awake by gunshots on Sunday morning. It was not clear at the time, but the government now says that there was a coup attempt. Now, armed men had tried to break into an armory at a military base near the president's home, then attacked two of the city's main prisons, releasing some of the inmates. There's more information for you in this intro package. Take a listen.
The political atmosphere in Sierra Leone has remained tense following the narrow presidential win in the re-election of President Adegboye in June 2023. In the early hours of Sunday, the 26th of November, residents of Freetown were woken by sounds of heavy gunfire as a group of unidentified individuals attempted to force their way into the country's largest military barracks, Wilberforce Barracks, in the capital, Freetown. The unidentified attackers in their dozens also targeted two prisons in the city, including the central prison where most of more than 2,000 inmates were freed. A civilian was also arrested in connection with the attack, and more than 100 of the freed inmates have reported back at the prisons amid a manhunt for fleeing suspects. Gunshots were heard in the capital on Tuesday as security forces tried to arrest one of the fleeing suspects. The Sierra Leonean government said it foiled the attack and repelled the attackers. After the attack, the Ministry of Information declared an immediate curfew, which was later lifted by 6 p.m. on Monday. Sierra Leone's government have said that attacks on several locations in the capital, Freetown, on Sunday were a failed attempt to overthrow the government, led mostly by bodyguards of former President Ernest Bai Koroma.
On the program today, Bakar, Professor of Sociology, United States, and also Nweke, Global Affairs Analyst, all the way from Belgium. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. Now, I would like to start off with you, Bakar. Now, what, of course, could have been the intention of these particular gunmen, even though we know that the government has sort of alleged that it was a coup attempt? What exactly could have been their motivation?
Well, we can only go by what we know from the public. And I think at a minimum, it is an attack on the authority of the existing government. And as the government of itself said, it is a coup attempt, which there's a history of that in the country. So it is a plausible explanation. Now, there are, of course, other people in the country who are alleging that it's an staged coup or coup attempt. But either way, I think it speaks to a problem of authority and a problem of security in the country.
All right, I'd like to go to Collins, of course, to know your opinion on this particular incident that happened on Sunday. Do you also feel that it was an attempt, on the authority of the state, or did this set of individuals have other ulterior motives?
From all indications, I believe that it is a combination of elements or factors here. And at the heart of what has happened is a general discontent with government. Now, an edge to it that is different from the classical coup that we have seen, particularly in the ECOWAS sub-region, is the fact that civilians have actually played a very, very significant role in this particular one. And that can only point to one thing, and that is the fact that, civilians are actually becoming more assertive in their rejection of, unholy practices of politicians that either led them to power or re-elect them. And so it does look like there is an emerging symbiotic relationship between the military on the one hand and the civilians in efforts to take back governments that are perceived to have been stolen by rogue politicians. That is basically my reading of the situation.
Now, I mean, if I'm to go back to you, of course, Abubakar, you said that, I mean, you might want to tilt to the statement by the official of the government saying it was some sort of coup attempt or attempt to take over the government. Now, would you say these individuals in some way were inspired by the recent trend that is happening, across Africa, or in some parts of Africa, where we are beginning to see men who are meant to be in the barracks take over the helms of affairs when it comes to government?
I think these kinds of issues or decisions or attempts are not light things, and I think it's not a single factor. Certainly, I think the environment matters, but in Sierra Leone there is a consistent history of military coups, so it is actually not anything that is quote unquote unusual to have either a coup or an attempted coup in Sierra Leone. Now, it is true that over the past decades after the Civil War, I mean, across in Sierra Leone, but also across Africa, there was some kind of effort to normalize elected government, and we saw a little decline in coups. But now, once those coups have started flaring up again, I think yes, it may, in a sense, I guess, give a little more confidence to people who may have actually thought of these things or not. But I think that is not that cannot be the underlying motivation. The motivation is actually the political conditions in the country, the history, and the very nature of politics in the country. Now, this is not to blame one particular person or the other, or one particular party against the other, but essentially it is a problem of the country itself.
I would like to stay with you. You said the very nature of politics in the country. How would you describe the nature of politics exactly in Sierra Leone?
Well, on the face of it, I mean, we talk of elected government, which is true. But if you go back to the history of Sierra Leone, since independence and onwards, what we do know is that actually the nature of government and governance has actually been tied to ethnic and regional alliances, identities, and that really shapes the way people vote. It shapes the way people use power. It shapes the way they apply power, and that is on both sides of the major political parties. So I think the nature of power and governance is highly ethnicized, and this is something that we actually saw coming out of the Lomé Peace Agreement, but also in the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was very clear.
I would like to go to you, Collins. Now, aside the fact that some might say maybe, the motivation of this armed men might be to take over government, some have also looked at social factors or issues. One of it is high unemployment rate in the country, where some people feel that you need to be affiliated with certain parties in order to have access to state jobs or even benefits. Do you think this also played a role?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we do know that the inflation rate in Sierra Leone at this point is 50%. Now, unemployment is rife. And so the only secure job that people can think about is jobs within government. And so it becomes a do or die to do whatever one can, either to retain an existing governmental job that you have, or if you are a government contractor, you do all that is humanly possible to retain it. And how people do this is by unholy alliances that they form. People who are opposed to government, of course, are afraid to speak out for fear of reprisals and the rest of them. So yes, it is what they call it in Nigeria, stomach infrastructure. And so people lean very much to politics, and along with that is also the ethnic politics that is very, very obnoxious in Sierra Leone, to the point that when people come to power, they actually weed the entire place of people that are not from their own ethnic group. So all of these factors do create tensions. And so next to the civilian coup d'etat that we are seeing in Africa, because when elections are not perceived to be free, fair, and credible, one can surmise that that is civilian coup d'etat. And so those who are in a position to try to reverse what they consider to be stolen mandate from them, they simply take the laws into their hands. And that is what the military and some civilians have done in this case in Sierra Leone.
All right, I'd like to stay on the one of the issues that both of you have highlighted, talking about ethnic politics. I'm going back to you right now, Bakar. Is that enough, will I call it, drive politically, particularly when it comes to power tussle and all of that, as against the ability to deliver on the benefits of democracy? So what I'm saying is this: irrespective of whatever tribe or maybe culture you practice or you're from, I mean, the bottom line is people getting the dividends of democracy, having to live a good life. Is ethnic politics a strong, will I say, or integral part or foundation of Sierra Leonean politics?
Unfortunately, that is true. That has been the case, and it is still true. So I think the dividends of democracy is very important to note. What is the dividends of democracy? Okay. And you even have to ask, what is democracy? Because voting alone is not necessarily democracy. Okay? But to the dividend, I think what we have seen in Sierra Leone since the end of the war really is that the governments on both sides, that is from both political parties that have come, overall, really, they are not really very, very efficient. Actually, they are not very efficient. I know at the end of the war, there was some kind of post-war economy, but generally, both the Sierra Leone People's Party and the All People's Congress, which have ruled the country since the end of the Civil War, both of them have really failed from governance. And meaning both in terms of addressing poverty issues, but also in terms of actually delivering justice and actually treating people fairly. So I think I would say really there hasn't really been much dividends of democracy yet. So again, going back to the question of ethnicity, I think as my dear colleague here was mentioning, it is a driver, because one of the ways in which people get access to resources, positions, and so forth, it is through ethnic affiliations. And by the way, those in power tend to trust more people of their ethnic group. So you get this. So until you actually find some kind of institutional arrangement to address the nature of politics in the country, so that you don't have a winner-take-all kind of democracy, you will keep on having these kinds of issues.
All right. I mean, let's talk about Western influence right now. We're going to you, Collins. We've seen where, across many parts of Africa, where we've seen coup attempts and also some successful one, in spite of the fact that, surprisingly, it has, what I call it, the support of the citizens. Many are seeing it as some sort of liberation, from the West, particularly Francophone-speaking countries. Would you also want to say somewhat this sort of rubbed off on what we saw in Sierra Leone on Sunday?
Well, some of us who have been very much outspoken against, military takeover of power in support of, democracy and the rule of law, are finding it more and more difficult to sustain such a position in the face of flagrant abuse of democratic processes, in the face of complete absence of governance, in the face of failing economy and lack of productivity and excessive dependence on import. These are all the things that have left Africa high and dry, to the point that people are no longer, civilians are no longer able to, contain the situation and are actually embracing military takeover of power. Now, the hands of the Western democracies, of course, is littered all over the space in Africa. What do they call it? The West call it, national interest. And make no mistake about this, the West will always be present in these places where very, very bad things are happening, as long as it favors them, as long as it fits within their definition of national interest. And so it beholds the rest of the world to continue to speak out against such national interest, because yes, foreign policy, diplomacy is woven around the national interest, but it depends on how narrowly or how broadly you define national interest. Now, national interest that includes stability in other parts of the world makes sense, because that will mean that the migration, the illegal migration that you are talking about, people coming from war zones to share in your resources and all of that, will stop. Support for job creating measures in emerging economies, those are very good things that keep young people back in their countries. But more importantly, the very, very bad ways of plundering Africa, of their resources is also a major issue from the West that needs to be addressed.
All right, Abubakar, I would also like to, of course, throw that question to you. Do you think some sort of Western influence had some sort of role in what we saw in Sierra Leone on Sunday?
So I think, people in Africa, my brothers and sisters, wise up. We need to wise up. It is true that we live in a very integrated world, a mutually dependent world. We cannot really be free from that. And other countries will have interest within our countries. But fundamentally, we have to fix our countries. We, the people in Africa, have to fix our countries. And that begins with a lot of things, but in particular, you have to ensure that your political system do not create persistent and consistent marginalization. If you live in a country that is shared among people of various cultures, call them ethnicities, regions, identities, you have to be smart enough to think of a form of a state in which you do not have winner-take-all kind of political outcomes. So we need to design the states. Again, I go back to Sierra Leone. The Lome Peace Agreement and the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission told us the causes of war, told us the causes of political instability. We need to fix that. And it begins with ending the politics of winner-take-all elections that are based on ethnic identities, whether people know it or not. It begins with actually creating inclusive political systems, not by some kind of president picking somebody here and here. No, I mean things that are ingrained in the institutions of the state, that balances power, that ensures that people have a stake in it. And from there, then you can move on to other things, economies, good governance, and so on and so forth.
Okay, I want you to clarify something you said. You used the phrase winner take all. What are you trying to suggest? Are you saying that at the end of every elections, instead of, a single political party imagined as winner, are you talking of mergers? Are you talking of alliances, collaborations between parties to run the state, to represent, the multi-ethnic diversity of, that composition? What exactly are you painting?
Yes, I'm actually talking of the institutions of the state, not just the government in narrow sense. Here's what happens. Typically, you get elections in Sierra Leone. You have two political parties, major political parties. One of them win, and it doesn't matter whoever controls the executive will control all forms of power in the country. They will control the legislature, whether they win it or not. They will do that. They will control the judiciary. So, and of course, then it comes back to their tribal basis. What I am actually calling for here is that to go back to the drawing board, think of actually what kind of electoral system, what kind of systems of power you can have that allows different parts of the country, or people from different parts of the country, ethnicities, to be represented in the government. It has to be done in a way that actually it is not just a convenience alliance which a president can end at any time. But I mean, when I talk of decentralization, when I talk of forms of election that actually creates representations, whether you talk of even constitutional mandates that allows for it doesn't really matter how, but my point is that you do have to end the system wherein one group wins an election, and they take all the power, and they bring their ethnic folks and the people from their region, and the next people come and they do the same thing.
This, of course, has brought to the fore the conversation around the, will I call it, validity of democracy being a blanket system of government, across Africa. Some have questioned, the veracity of it. That is democracy a true and the best, form of government for all of African states? I would like to know your opinion on this. I will start with you, Collins.
Well, we've been on this path before, haven't we? This perennial conversation about whether democracy is good for Africa or not good for Africa. Look, democracy is good. So far, it has been found to be the best form of government, but it doesn't fall on nobody's laps. You've got to work for it, you've got to nurture it and make the best out of it. Now, there are alternatives like the feudal, system where, the kings and the chiefs are the ones that call the shot and the rest might just as well shut up. Africa has tried it. In some parts of Africa, it is still thriving, in the local areas. How democratic is that? So you see, those people who question whether democracy works for Africa or not are actually the dictatorial ones that, wouldn't want to take the voice and the wishes of the people into consideration. I think the focus should be on making democracy work for Africa by getting Africans to actually work out for themselves what works best for them. But at the end of the day, it will mean a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Anything short of these three pillars is actually inimical to freedom, is inimical to liberty, and those who promote such are people who have dictatorial tendencies. So work for the brand of democracy that works for Africa, and you will see that democracy is the best form of government.
I'd like to know Abubakar's opinion on this. Is democracy?
Yes. Thank you very much. Of course, democracy is good for Africa and it can work. But here, whenever you hear somebody say democracy, you have to ask them, what do you mean by democracy? Okay? Democracy is a system of government that actually puts a limit on power and also represents the people. Now, when you say representation, you have to ask, who are you representing? Election by itself is not necessarily democracy. Okay, we need to understand that having just election doesn't mean you have democracy, but election has been a vehicle through which we do have representation. One thing that is important in Africa is that we have to understand the nature of the state. The state is not some kind of organic, really integrated state and so forth. It is what Europeans call national state. It is actually a multi-ethnic divided country. So what I'm saying is that democracy can work only if we understand who are we representing. Because African states are characterized by divisions around region and ethnicity, it means we have to have a system of representation that reflects that. Many democracies in the world, including the United States, is not a one-person, one-vote system. So we have to run away from this idea that you organize elections, one person, one vote, and you get 51% or whatnot, and you don't. No, that is not democracy. You have to represent, and to represent means you represent the people in terms of the way they identify. If ethnicity is the basis of identification, then you have to devise a political system that ensures that representation.
Okay, so because I'm trying to get your point, are you saying that Africa actually needs to, or each state in Africa needs to devise a form of democracy that adapt a form of democracy that works for it, and not necessarily what is practiced maybe in the Western world?
Absolutely.
So that would make it. That would make it. Well, I mean, that would make it some sort. That would be democracy in itself per se. It might just be quasi-democracy. So let's say okay. I'm trying to look at it. We talk about simple majority, for instance. When it comes to voting, the individual with the highest amount of numbers. But at the end of the day, there's also the aspect of representation, like you've mentioned. a state that has multi-ethnic group and maybe a particular ethnic group has, will I call it, a lion's share of the votes and all of that, and then it's successive. So you find out that some people gradually start becoming the minority. How is that inclusive?
That's my point. That's exactly what I was saying. That is not, so that doesn't lead you to proper democracy. What you need in those cases is to design a state in such a way that actually different ethnic groups will be represented in the political system in a way that actually it cannot just be taken away by a president or by a leader. So I think we're saying the same thing. Now, the question here is, how do you do that? Whether you do rotational systems, whether you do shared presidencies, whether you do proportional representation, whether you do federations, every country will have to work that for itself. But the point is that when you have simple neoliberal elections, one person gets a simple majority and takes all the power, that doesn't produce representation in a multi-ethnic divided society. And it will always lead to people to either want to cheat or not to accept the result, because democracy only works when you have a real chance for being represented. And that is not what we see in Africa.
All right, gentlemen. Well, right now we'll go on a quick break. When we return, of course, we'll examine the visit of ECOWAS delegate to Sierra Leone to actually show their support for the government and also reaffirm the fact that they are willing to support militarily and otherwise should the need be. Well, we'll look at this and other adjoining issues on this topic when we return. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. If you just joined in, this is Secure the Continent, and we have been looking at the attempted coup in Sierra Leone. And of course, we still have on the program Bakar, Professor of Sociology from the United States, and also Nweke, Global Affairs Analyst from Belgium. Thank you so much for hanging on, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, now let's examine the visit of the, of course, ECOWAS delegate or delegation to Sierra Leone in solidarity. Now, what do you make of this particular visit, and how significant or much of an impact will this make? I'd like to start with you, Collins.
Well, I mean, it's a very good, moral boost to the government of Sierra Leone. Luckily, this time around, it didn't succeed, and so there is no need for any threat of military intervention like we've seen ECOWAS do in, other instances, which of course they found to be, a very bad idea. But one good thing about the way that ECOWAS has conducted itself, particularly under the leadership of President Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, who is currently the chairperson of, the ECOWAS heads of government, is that they have left no doubt about the fact that coup attempts are not to be tolerated. But I mean, they need to go a lot further than that, because obviously what we have seen ECOWAS done in the past is, when they see signs of bad things evolving in some of these countries, they simply look the other way. Mm-hmm. They have to start acting more preemptively than they have been doing in the past. And I do hope that now that, they are transiting from, the toothless bulldog status that barks but never bites to one that is actually ready to take action, that such action should be extended to helping to nurture democracy, good governance, because those are the sort of things that keep the military guys in the barracks rather than getting them to the government house. And when they see bad things happening, when they see signs of them, they should intervene in good enough time to prevent escalation. So yes, the moral boost is good, and more needs to be done from ECOWAS.
All right, I would like to just, of course, add a bit to what you have said, Collins, and direct the question to Bakar. Now, some have actually said that ECOWAS' approach, particularly with the recent surge in, well, I call it military takeover when it comes to power, is somewhat faulty. That maybe the ECOWAS should actually look at the root causes, which is which goes back to good governance, quality governance, better form of living, and all of that. Basically, the dividends of democracy. Maybe the ECOWAS should start from there, drawing up a scorecard for governments and asking critical questions. You know, when certain governments are found wanting. Do you also share in that school of thought?
Absolutely. So I think we should hope that the visit of ECOWAS to Sierra Leone is a solidarity with the country, not necessarily with the government. I think we have to understand the difference between the country and the government. Okay? The people and those who govern, they are not the same. So the African Union and ECOWAS, all these African systems, we do have mechanisms. One set of mechanisms talk about the shared African security, reforms of non-indifference, when we intervene when there's a trouble in countries, but also there is a lot of mechanisms about good governance from the AU and also to ECOWAS. I agree with both of you. To see coups in simply as a challenge on the authority of an elected government is a very simplistic way to think of it. Of course, there are people who want power and they will do everything. But I think when you have a country in which there is consistent indications of bad governance from both political parties, from the previous government and from the one that is there, when you have consistent systems that actually undermine people's liberty, when you have systems that actually creates more and more poverty, when you have people becoming rich, out of political office, you have to start speaking. So I think what really ECOWAS need to do is to actually be, to take the same kind of approach that it uses through military intervention, to take the same way in terms of enforcing good governance. Now, for that to happen, we need good role models. If all the countries are more or less like that, who can speak? So I think we need breakaway countries. We need countries that can be a good model. We need countries that really do the right thing. And from there, they will have a moral leverage to speak to other African countries. But again, don't oversimplify challenges to any government. There are causes, and I think those have to be addressed.
I'm still staying with you now. Going back to Sierra Leone specifically, what do you see happening in the coming weeks in terms of the implication of this coup, particularly on the political and security landscape and architecture of the country?
Well, I am an academic, and I've seen a lot of these things. But generally, what happens when you do have security breaches, governments tend to be, more afraid, and they tend to be more authoritarian. They tend to take much more a security approach. I wish those in power can actually use this as an opportunity to really reflect on some of the fundamental causes or fundamental, concerns, and really go back to the TRC report, the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and be honest about what can be done. So I think to answer your question, I think securitization would be the natural kind of approach. I don't think that's the right approach. I think people need to go back to inclusive politics, constitutional politics, and not to have just some kind of elite collusion that actually plunders the people. I mean, serious, honest, and critical thinking about under what conditions you can have a multi-ethnic country, people live together in a way that is actually fair and equitable.
All right, gentlemen, we'll go on a quick break. Of course, when we return, this time around, we will be looking at what can be done to stem the very worrisome rise of military takeovers across Africa. Stay with us. to the continent, and of course we are examining the attempted coup in Sierra Leone. And we still have on the program Bakar, Professor of Sociology from the United States, and also Nweke, Global Affairs Analyst from Belgium. Gentlemen, I'd like to, of course, continue the conversation with you, Collins. Now, there has been a worrisome rise in military takeovers across Africa since January 2023. The continent has experienced so far 4 coups, particularly in Gabon, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. What do you think can be done urgently at the regional level and also at the continental level to actually stem this particular tide?
I'd like to simply line up behind Professor Barr, where he talked about the fact that the initial inclination is to want to securitize, the whole place and bully people around and, create the impression that, there is a whole fortress built around the president and his men. That will be wrong. It will be wrong because going by taking Sierra Leone as an example in terms of what needs to happen going forward in an organic manner is to be reflective, and out of that reflection, if the president wants to tell himself the truth, and if he really wants, sustainable peace in Sierra Leone, what he ought to do now is reach out to, the different disenfranchised individuals across ethnic lines, because it is not news what is happening. They know what their grievances are. And so pretending not to know what aches them actually aggravates the situation. Get them to the discussion table, and if possible, as a matter of fact, it is even a necessity for him to reshuffle his government and bring in some of these people that, have felt discontented. And from there on, he can begin to see, the semblance of peace. Now, I'm using Sierra Leone as an example, but I'm also saying that in all of these other places, in sub-Saharan Africa, ECOWAS region, to be more specific, that the situation is the same. They know exactly what is happening: bad economic policies, corruption, ethnic politics, and all of those vices. So when you begin from there, in beginning to correct those anomalies, I think is a good start. And then ECOWAS, like I said previously, needs to step up the game by acting in a more preemptive manner. There is sufficient instruments, even as, it is true that ECOWAS is not meant to, intervene in sovereign states. They have sufficient margin actually to, get them to comply to the rule of law and good governance. They should do that.
Well, I'll be going back to you, Abubakar, but this time around, we know that since the COVID-19 pandemic, our countries across the world, particularly Africa, economies have been really, really struggling. And it appears like many of the governments, don't know what to do. They seem pretty much handicapped, particularly when it comes to Africa. Now, what do you think governments can actually do? Because, I mean, the bottom line of all of this is the economy is the lifeline of any nation. Once the people are doing well, people have food to eat, they're able to afford, basic standard of living, they can afford accommodation, they can put, clothes on their backs. They tend to question the government, less. But when all of these factors are not there, then you see people beginning to question the policies of the government critically. So COVID-19 happened, threw a lot of economies into chaos, particularly within the African continent. It appears like many of these governments don't even know what to do, don't have a way forward. Hence, you see agitations and counter-agitations and also protests and maybe coup attempts. What do you think in terms of the economy many of these African countries can do to get back on track?
Well, I'll leave some part of that for the economists, but here's some points to emphasize on that. precisely for those reasons. We know the numbers on poverty and economic indicators in Africa. Precisely because there's so much economic need and poverty, it is precisely for that you need to have a government that do not aggravate those kinds of things by actually being unrepresentative, being marginalizing other people. So in a sense, what I'm saying here is that actually, yes, economic conditions are difficult. And now when you add to that other forms of systems of oppression, you can see how that actually becomes very, very difficult. I think people are not, people are understanding. People understand there's a global crisis. People understand that. But to hide behind global economic crises, to avoid really addressing the other issues in Africa, I think it's a very big mistake. Fundamentally, I think here's the issue here. You want to minimize the amount of problems you have in a country. Okay, you have economic crisis. Now, maybe you're not able to address all of those things because of industry and so forth. Well, why do you want to add other kinds of problems there, political crisis and so forth? So I think, coming from a sociological background, you can actually only have an economy when you actually have stability. And you can only have stability in a country when actually people feel to be represented in that country, when there's an element of justice, when there's element of people can understand that, well, this is fair. Look, people know the difference between what is fair and what is not fair. So I think, to talk of African economic development is wonderful, but trust me, you need political development first. And that political development means you have to think of your state, you have to think of your country, which people do you have there, how are they represented in the systems of power, and what that means to them. I'll give you one simple example here. You guys in Nigeria, right? I know a lot of issues in Nigeria, but just see one thing that happened in Nigeria since the introduction of democracy. Power rotates between North and the South. That's not by accident. Has it solved all of Nigeria's problems? No. But has it really helped? Trust me, I think it has helped a lot. That's what I mean. You have to have a political system in which people feel represented as, not just as individuals, but as groups of people, because that's the way we identify it. And when the politicians go around, they tell the people, your brother and your son and sister have come. Why don't you think that ethnicity or regionalism is the basis of identification? So again, you have to fix the state.
All right. All right. I would like to also direct the same question to Collins. We've seen governments in the course of trying to sort of manage the situation. Some of them have tried to cut the cost of governance. We've seen some increase taxes and all of that in terms of policies. Where are they getting it wrong? And what do you think can be done to, of course, steer the ship of the country in the right direction?
To answer that question, Dapo, I'm going to lean on the words of a friend of mine with whom I was having a conversation, and he said one thing that stuck with me, and that is the fact that those who say the right things, those who do the right things, that have knowledge, critical skills that Africa needs in its development, are the last people that will be called to the table in terms of helping to craft the solutions needed for Africa's problems. So I think that's a good place to start. It's a good place to start in terms of, number one, starting with getting round pegs into round holes. Now, it is not rocket science. The same COVID-19 actually devastated the economies in the West. We know what was done, even right during the COVID itself and thereafter. Take, for instance, palliatives. Take, for instance, all sorts of, incentives and measures to pop up, businesses and to support individuals. Right here in Belgium, where I am, there is something called job bonus. This job bonus is one of those things that, one of those incentives or instruments that is being used to put more money in the pockets of, the hardworking people. Now, in Africa, what we had then was palliatives that were meant for individuals. They were voted for, in terms of the money, but they didn't manage to get to the people. The same politicians actually found ways of actually reselling it to the same people. So you see, if they fight corruption and get the right people into, the right places, they will be able to craft the best solution to, alleviate the poverty and the economic hardship.
All right, thank you so much. Bakar, Professor of Sociology from the United States, and Collins Nweke, Global Affairs Analyst from Belgium. Gentlemen, once again, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure. Have a good
Nice
weekend.
to meet you.